Hello everyone. This week we talk about Anaximander. So last week we talked about Thales, who was considered the first philosopher and often the first scientist, one of the seven sages. Anaximander, who was his fellow citizen, possibly his student, but quite likely one of his younger friends or in his group of friends, who is often considered the first scientist. In fact, you have a book by Carlo Rovelli, the physicist, which says Anaximander, the first scientist, and he's considered to be the first proper scientific thinker of that time. Of course, not in our terms, of the Greek world, and in that sense of the Western world. And he is also one of the first, because it's assumed that Thales did not write very much. So he's also assumed to be one of the first to have, left written treatises. And we don't have much. We have just a couple of fragments, which we'll talk about actually. And it's nice to have like the first fragment, because even with Thales, as you noticed, we don't have a fragment. We only have testimonia. But these fragments, or rather his works, or at least one of his works, was definitely available to Aristotle, because he quotes from it, and then Theophrastus quotes from it later, Aristotle's student, which means that we have at least secondary evidence that somebody had something written by Anaximander, which is different from Thales, because if you remember with Thales, what the problem was that even the ancients, like even Aristotle was talking from hearsay. Here, at least Aristotle, whom we more or less trust to quote properly, although as we discussed in the video, you can watch it on Sources and Origins. The problem with going to Aristotle, especially and to Plato especially, but even to Aristotle, is that they view everybody through the lens of their own philosophy, which means that you don't get an unbiased sort of record of these philosophers that they're talking about. But anyway, so what we know about him is that he was also from Miletus, so he's a Milesian. He was a younger friend and a fellow citizen. Whether or not he was a student, we can't be sure. There is a tradition that claims that he was one of the students of Thales. But the issue with this is that, in ancient times, people like to put people in this guru shishya parampara, so student, teacher and student, and then that student is the next teacher. So they like to have this kind of a series in terms of teachers and students, which, often did happen. For example, Aristotle is a student of Plato and Theophrastus of Aristotle. But with Anaximander, he may or may not have been a student of Thales, but he was definitely a fellow citizen. What works did he write? So he wrote, and this is a general title. We don't know whether he titled the work that, because I'm not sure they had titles in the same way as we understand it these days. But he wrote a book called Periphousios, which is on nature. And as I said, it could be called this, but it was on nature. He wrote a book called Rotation of the Earth, right? So, Ges Periodos and Periton Aplanon, the fixed stars, and Sphere. So we have a list of 4 works possibly by him. And we also have a list of his achievements, in the sense that he supposedly, most likely he actually probably did it if everybody claims so, published a map of the earth, so which means that he was a geographer, a map of the earth as he understood it, so I think it was something like if you think of it as a convex kind of a structure map, the navel would be at Delphi or maybe at Miletus, and then you'd have Europe and Asia and Libya. Libya is Africa, right? So you have these 3 sort of continents, and in the middle is the sea, the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean is at the center. So Delphi is at the center, and then from that sort of Europe goes in one direction, Asia goes in another, and Libya, which is Africa, goes in another direction. So he was a geographer, right? We know that about him. We know that he was an astronomer, most definitely so. because he tried to construct a celestial sphere, and he tried to construct an idea of what the celestial sphere would look like. And as you would see, he spent some time thinking about, the moons, the moon, the stars, eclipses, the phases of the moon. So he did, whatever he could observe with, whatever, his naked eye and instruments that he made. We'll get to that as well. He did sort of, did dabble, not just dabble, he was one of the early astronomers that we know of. He was also a geometer. As with Thales, we assume that he traveled around, so he introduced the gnomon. Gnomon would be something like a sundial, so something in which you'd have, this kind of a round object with this thing which would cast a shadow and which would tell the different times of the day. So something like a sundial. So he introduced a gnomon, which had been invented, as far as I understand, in Babylon. So he got it from there, and he introduced in some ways the division of the day into 12 parts with that gnomon, or rather sort of understood the day as being, I would not say introduced, because it's not like philosophers necessarily had the power to change the way people think of time. He was also in this sense, so a geographer, an astronomer, a geometer, and above all, and including all this, a natural philosopher, right? Also of the Milesian school, like Thales. So a natural philosopher. And what differentiated, as I said, we've talked about, Homer, Hesiod, and then, the advent of natural philosophy. So what really sort of distinguishes, these natural philosophers is the idea that nature, like human society, is ruled by a set of laws, and set of laws that come from nature itself, right? He really introduces this idea of the laws of nature. And in fact, the way he thinks of laws is pretty interesting. We'd see one of the very few quotes we have from him is the question of law and of retributive justice. The idea of justice, and how would nature understand justice, compared to how humans understand justice. And he makes a kind of parallel from human understandings of justice to natural understandings of justice. So there is an idea that there are laws of nature, and the disturbing of the laws of nature is a kind of injustice, adike, and it's a kind of injustice which will have retribution against it, right? So nature works according to certain idea of laws, and these laws themselves are a kind of question of action, retribution, justice, injustice. He thinks of them in these terms. Law is thought of in terms of how we would often think of human law. So when he introduces the laws, so-called, of nature, they are somewhat human influenced understanding of what law could actually mean in the first place. He introduced also what we would see, the idea of the apeiron, and I'll do a complete one video on this actually. The idea of apeiron as arche, and arche, if you remember from our previous few videos and the number of times I've talked about it, is the principle, the beginning, the principle that sort of explains the beginning of things and what things are constituted from. And what he talks about, this apeiron, so is a negating prefix, right? And peras are boundaries. So apeiron is something that does not have boundaries, which means something that is boundless, infinite, unlimited. And he introduced this idea, post Thales, who talks about water, and water is also a kind of, boundless thing the way Thales understands it, but it's one element, right? And it's very specific. It's an element you can find in nature, right? So it's a sort of more immediately tangible thing that you can find. Now, what Anaximander does is that he makes it more abstract. So instead of talking about an element, like air or fire and water, and these things will come back, in different ways. We'll see with the next philosopher we talk about, Anaximanders, that he actually then sort of says air. And it's not actually a step back, you will realize from Anaximander, but it's a step forward in a different way because he starts thinking about transmutation of matter. But let's sort of stick with Anaximander right now. he starts thinking in a much more abstract way. So, when he introduces apeiron, what he's doing is he's now starting to talk about something that, you cannot visualize per se. What is this boundless? What is this infinite matter, boundless matter? So it's a more kind of an abstract philosophical matter that he's introducing, rather than an immediate tangible matter like water or fire or earth or air or whatever. And for example, when we were talking about the pre-philosophical cosmogonies, where those were then anthropomorphized in addition. So you had Okeanos, but then Okeanos is also a god, and that god is human-like and is married to Tethys. So it becomes much more complicated. With Thales, you saw a step forward to going towards talking about water per se as a material thing, water. In fact, there were these philosophers were known as hylozoists, or are known as hylozoists. Hyle means matter, and zoe means life. So the ones who think of matter as being alive, right? Hyle, material matter, hylozoist, right? So what Anaximander adds here is that he's talking not about water or any other element, but a different substance which is boundless. And it is still a substance. It's still a matter. Apeiron is matter, but it's a very abstract matter, right? It's matter in a much more abstract way than the way Thales presents it. So what Anaximander is saying then is that there is no particular element that underlies the rest. It's not water that underlies all other things, but something else, right? This boundless thing. And which means that when we talk about movement or change or genesis or birth and perishing, it is not accounted for by the qualitative sort of alteration of that element, one element, like water becomes ice and water sort of becomes air, vapor and air, but he will think of a different. He has to think of a different way now of accounting for alteration and change, and we'll see that he comes up with this idea of opposites and separation of opposites, and you will notice the sort of similarity in some ways to Hesiod. When we said first came chaos, and remember we talked about chaos as being gap. First came gap, and what is gap? Gap is separation. So here as well, the idea of separation or gap, or the sort of going apart of things. And if you want to with carefulness, go towards modern cosmology, you can think of it as a big bang, but not quite, because it's not like, everything is, and there's a bang and it separates out. Rather, there is a constant motion towards and away. So the idea of a separating out of elements is something that, like he introduced. So his, in some ways, like just to summarize, and then we'll go into details, is that his momentous step in that sense would be the introduction of a notion of an imperceptible element, right? An element that you cannot perceive. This apeiron is an imperceptible element. And this imperceptible element then sort of transforms, transmutes, changes, is brought to become, the perceptible world. So the idea that an imperceptible thing, an imperceptible element underlies, the chaos of the perceptible world, is something that, is pretty interesting, is a pretty interesting introduction by Anaximander. And I'll read out from, the Kirk and Raven, an introduction to sort of Anaximander given by Diogenes Laertius, who did have these Lives of Philosophers. So, Anaximander, son of Praxiades of Miletus, he said that the principle and element is the indefinite. This indefinite is how they've translated apeiron, not distinguishing air or water or anything else. He was the first to discover a gnomon, and we talked about gnomon, which is this sundial. And he set up one up on the sundials in Sparta, according to Favorinus in his Universal History, to mark solstices and equinoxes. So this sundial did have some use. And he also constructed hour indicators. He first drew an outline of Earth and sea, so this is the map, but he also constructed a celestial globe, right? So he made a map, but he also made a sphere. Remember that spheron that we talked about. Of his opinions, he made a summary exposition. So that means he wrote a book, which I suppose Apollodorus the Athenian also encountered. Apollodorus says in his chronicles that Anaximander was 64 years old in the second year of the 58th Olympiad. So which means that he also noted down a particular date when he was alive. So we can date him with much more precision, which I don't remember if I sort of, gave you the dates. I think I gave it to you in the first class. So Anaximander, we assume, is from around 611 to 546 BC. So this was probably 547 BC, this Olympiad that he's talking about. Anyway, and that he died shortly afterwards, and that's why, so 1 year after, having been near his prime approximately during the time of Polycrates, tyrant of Samos. So we are able to date him with some semi-precision, and that's how we are able to date Thales, who we assume was older than him by, let's say, about 40 years, let's assume, and that he had certain scientific interests, that he wrote certain books, that he set up, these gnomons and measured equinoxes and solstices. And I don't know, there's another place where he actually apparently also managed to predict an earthquake by looking at, some natural science, I don't know what, and told everybody, so this is another story that we have, that he told everybody to go out and sleep outside at night or something. So that, he was also credited to have, and this is pretty important, with the philosophers, why they started being respected, also ridiculed, as you saw with the story of Thales and the well, and he fell down the well and, a servant girl laughed at him. So ridiculed as well, but also respected because, Thales, for example, predicted that eclipse. He was able to predict, apparently, when you would have a bumper crop of olives and make a lot of money if he wanted to. And on the other hand, Anaximander could predict an earthquake, which saved lives, I assume. So, so you can see, why, these scientist philosophers, a bit dodgy, looking at the sky. And if you read Aristophanes' Clouds, you have like a very sort of fun, description of, common attitudes towards philosophers. You should read it. It's extremely entertaining. If you get to watch it, nobody's luckier than you. So, and in the next video, I will talk a bit more about Anaximander's philosophy. So, thank you.